All of your mics are on mute just to reduce the background noise. If you have any questions, feel free to enter those in the chat box. I have Charlotte here with me, who is going to be helping me manage that chat box. And then at the end of the webinar, there will be a time if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question via the phone. So before we dive into how you're going to be entering information on the reporting tool, I just wanted to provide everyone with some high-level information that you should know. First off, you are going to be filling out this tool on a monthly basis. This is just to make sure that you're keeping track of all your achievements at your site, and also makes it so that when your supervisor is ready to submit their 6-month report, all of the information of the work that you've done is in one place for them to get. Secondly, there are no due dates or prescribed timelines for when you need to be filling this tool out. It's really up to you to set a timeline that works for you and make sure that you capture all of your achievements for the past month, and don't forget anything or lose track of anything. So because there are no timelines or due dates, that means that myself or Debbie here at NeighborWorks or anyone at CNCS are not going to be seeing these reporting tools. They really just are for you and your supervisor. The only reason that we might be asking to look at them is if we are conducting a site visit, or if there are some questions that we have about the 6-month report and we just need some clarification. Another thing you should know is that you are only going to be reporting on the achievements that you have as a Vista at your site. That means you shouldn't be reporting any of the achievements that your site has or the other staff at your site, just what you do. And I know this can be tricky sometimes because our Vistas work so closely with the other staff and other teams there. But just try to think of it as, what are you doing as an individual, or what are the things that you have or play a really critical role in being a success. So the next thing I wanted to point out is that this data tracking tool was designed by CNCS. So that means that all of the information that we're asking you to provide for us in here is information that CNCS is looking for specifically and keeping track of. The reason that we have one tool that is used by all of our Vistas, even though our Vistas are doing such unique work in different fields, is so that at the end we can collect all this information across all our Vistas, across multiple years, and show collectively the impact that our program is having. So one thing I wanted to just give you a little tip on before we get started is that when it comes to filling this out, I recommend you set aside a specific time, a regular time every month, to go back and fill in the information about your achievements for the past month. It's really up to you to decide whether you want to track from the first to the last day of the month or the mid to the mid point of each month, but just make sure that there are no gaps or overlaps between your reporting dates. And also you need to make sure that you are backfilling this reporting tool to your first day of service. So for those of you who started on September 3rd, for example, you need to make sure that you are going back to the September 3rd date. So that is all the information that I have for the high-level overview. Before we dive into filling the tool out, are there any questions? Feel free to shoot those in the chat box. Do we have any questions, Charlotte?
I'm not seeing any right now.
Okay. Great, so we are going to move on to the reporting tool. So as you can see on my screen, I have it pulled up and to the first sheet, which is the cover sheet. On this sheet, it's essentially just going to collect all the information that you enter on the preceding sheets and populate it into this really nice, succinct summary. Everything right now is zeros, but the only information that you are going to be entering on this sheet is these 6 fields at the top. which are your personal information, your site information, and the date. So all of your personal information and site information is going to stay the same month to month. And the only data that's going to change on this page is the dates. So once you have entered in all of that information, you can go ahead and start entering data on the following sheets. So the first sheet that you come to is the volunteers page. And this might look a little confusing or overwhelming at first, but on each of the pages where you can enter information, there are these little definition boxes and instruction boxes. So feel free to use those to help you fill out your reporting tool. And of course, if you have any additional questions after that, feel free to reach out to me. So I'm going to explain the layout of this sheet just a little bit because it's very similar to the layout of the following sheets. On the left here, you have the 3 focus areas that NeighborWorks projects fall into. And those are housing literacy, financial literacy, housing, and employment. So when you start entering in information, you want to make sure that you're entering it into the right focus area for whatever the project is that you're doing. So I'm going to run us through a scenario. And let's just say that you are helping to facilitate a workshop at your site to provide strategies for energy conservation to residents. And you're not really sure where energy conservation falls into any of these 3 focus areas. If you're unsure, you really want to think about what is the mission of your project or your workshop. And in the case of this energy conservation example, the mission is that you're trying to save households money on their utility bills. So you would go ahead and enter that information as a financial literacy service. So then from here, you're going to enter the information of your outputs, which are essentially the capacity building strategies or services that you're implementing at your site. First off, there are volunteer management practices, and those are essentially any kind of new system or tool that you develop to help manage volunteers and volunteer hours at your site. So an example of that might be a new tracking system to keep track of the volunteer hours, or a new intake form for when volunteers join your site. But those are just some examples. We're going to go ahead and move on from the management practices to the volunteers recruited and volunteers managed. So it's really, really important here that you keep your volunteers recruited and your volunteers managed separate, and that you're not double reporting for any volunteers. Volunteers recruited are going to be any new volunteers that you have been involved in the process of doing outreach and engagement and getting them to sign up to do service with your site. Volunteer managed are volunteers that are already affiliated with your site, have already signed up to be volunteers, and you're just helping support them and facilitate a specific event with those volunteers. So in our example of the energy conservation workshop, we're going to say that you recruited 2 new volunteers to join and help facilitate this workshop for you. The workshop that you conducted was 2 hours long, and so that would mean you had a total of 4 volunteer hours performed. So you can go ahead and enter those there. Because these volunteers were new and you were involved in the recruitment process for them, you would not need to count the volunteers managed here. So we're going to go ahead and put 0 for the volunteers managed and the number of hours served by volunteers managed. Now that you've filled out your outputs or your services sections, you're going to go ahead and fill in your outcomes, which are essentially the impact that your services had on the community. And here you're going to track the number of beneficiaries or attendees who received the services that you helped provide. So for this example, we're going to say that the workshop that you put on had a total of 5 attendees from economically disadvantaged individuals. So you would go ahead and put that 5 in the beneficiaries up there. And then to be able to track the number of individuals who increased their financial knowledge, you need to be able to back that up in some way. So for this example, we're just going to say that you conducted a pre and post evaluation during your workshop, and that based on the results from that evaluation, you saw that 4 of those individuals improved their financial knowledge. So you would go ahead and put a 4 in there. One thing I want to make note of before we move on is that making sure, as I said before, not to double count your volunteers recruited and volunteers managed. So for example, next month, if you hosted this same workshop with the same volunteers, those volunteers would actually now be moved over to the volunteers managed column because they are no longer new volunteers. And then you want to make sure that you don't count them as volunteers recruited anymore. So as you can see, all of your totals are displayed here at the bottom. And if that is all that you have done for the volunteer sheet, then you can go ahead and move on to the next sheet, which is resource development. Okay, so on resource development, as you can see, the layout is somewhat similar. You have your focus areas, financial literacy, housing, and employment here on the left, and the different strategies or services you might be providing here on the top. And resource development pretty much relates to any kind of cash or service or goods that you might be fundraising to support your organization. So we're going to run through another example here. And for this example, we're going to say that your organization has a housing initiative to support households in having access to stable housing. And in order to support this initiative, let's say you were able to fundraise $500 through outreach and getting donors to commit to sending in donations. So you would put that dollar value in the value of cash resources leveraged. And then we're going to move on to in-kind resources. Here you can track the value of any kind of goods or services that are not cash that you're able to fundraise for your organization. So for the sake of our example, we're going to say that you got a local consultancy firm to commit to providing their services at a networking event. You would definitely want to make sure that you track that and make sure again that you can always back up any data that you're entering into this tool. So if you're receiving any kinds of goods or services, always ask for a voided invoice or any kind of documentation that can show the value of that service or good. So let's say that the consultancy firm told you that the services they were providing at the networking event was worth a total of $200. You would go ahead and put that value in there. And then in this last tab, you can track the number of grants that you submit or have a really heavy hand in helping to submit. So we're going to say that you submitted 2 grants in order to fundraise more money for this housing initiative, and that both the grants were worth $1,000. So for this month, this would be what you track, but next month, let's say that you find out that one of those grants was denied and one of them was approved. Next month, you would want to make sure to capture that $1,000 that you did get approved for over here in the cash value, the value of cash resources. So that is how you fill out the resource development sheet. Do we have any questions before I move on?
I'm just going to go really quickly through a few that I've already answered in the chat box, but just to read it out for anyone who's just on the phone. The first question said, for the first report, can we fill it out for the first 3 months, like from your first day of service, or do you need to do individual reports? The answer to that is yes. Please feel free to have your first report be more comprehensive, to include all the data from your first day of service onwards, and then going forward, please fill the tool out on a monthly basis. Other questions were, do we have access to this template? Yes, but we will send that out again after the webinar. Let's see. Okay, and then we had a really good question about how do we know whether or not to count our participants as economically disadvantaged? That is really a nuanced and very good question, and something that I will follow up with after this webinar, but good question.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, keep sending in those questions. Those are really great. Okay, the next sheet is the community needs assessment. So the community needs assessment covers quite a wide range of different surveys or evaluations that you might conduct in your community in order to identify community needs or gaps in services, or really just anything that your community might be concerned about. So for the sake of providing an example, we're going to say that you conducted a survey within residents in the community to identify what the barriers to employment were and what kind of services, employment services those residents might be seeking. And even if you conducted that survey with 20 individuals, you want to make sure to just report it as a 1, because it was one survey and therefore one total assessment. If there are any questions about this page, it's a little bit straightforward and rather broad. So there's a lot of different things that could fall under community needs assessment. One way to try and help you figure out if what you are doing is a community needs assessment is if what you're finding out is a trackable impact. You want to make sure that whatever you're trying to figure out, you can see whether or not you are figuring it out enough or not. We're going to move on to the training sheet. If you have any questions about community needs assessment, we can definitely revisit this page. So for training here, you just want to track any training events that you provide, training protocols that you help develop or roll out to staff. So for this one sheet, we're just gonna say that you help develop and are training staff at your site on how to provide financial literacy courses for residents. This course curriculum that you developed, you're going to provide 2 different training sessions that staff can attend. So we'll say here that you provided 2 different training events, and that each one of those events separately was 1 hour, and that would mean that you had a total of 2 hours worth of training events. And then let's just say that 3 people or 3 staff members attended your first training event and 2 attended the second one. So you could go ahead and put a 5 in that field. So again, relatively straightforward. Feel free to ask any questions if you have any about the trainings tab, but we're going to go ahead and move on to the new business processes. Okay. So similar to the community needs assessment, new business processes cover quite a wide range of different strategies or services that you might be employing. But essentially what they are is any kind of new system or tool or protocol that you are developing and implementing at your site to increase their capacity. So for example, we're just going to say that you created a new system for collecting information on new data points on properties in the area, and a data management system for that. So we're going to count that as one new business process. And one thing I want to make note of on this sheet is that even if your new business process takes you, say, 4 months to develop and implement, you want to make sure that you're only capturing it once. If each month that you are working on that, you fill this sheet out and are reporting a 1 for each month, when your supervisor takes all of your reporting tools and puts them together in the 6-month review or report, it's going to look like you created 4 different business processes. So just make sure that you're tracking things once and not double counting them. Great, if there are no questions about new business processes, we're gonna go ahead and move on to the miscellaneous tab. Here, there are just a number of specific data points that CNCS is looking for, mostly relating to military and military family services, foreclosure prevention services, disadvantaged youth services, or the community impact survey. And so for any of these, just make sure that you're connecting with your supervisor and talking about whether or not you and your site are tracking these and what you should do for reporting on these performance measures. Okay, we've made it to the last sheet. This is where you're going to be able to track anything that really has not fit into any of the previous sheets. Now, we really want you to try and figure out how you can fit your work into the other tracking sheets so that it can be looked at collectively with all the other work that the other vistas are doing. But we understand that it's sometimes just not possible and you're just doing something that really doesn't fit. This would be a place where you can tell us about any activities or services that you're doing at your site. And then as well as give us some narrative describing what that is. So an example of an activity that might not fit into, that doesn't fit into any of the other sheets is, say you attended a training to learn new strategies on preventing foreclosure. And that was a 2-day training that you attended. And at the end, you wrote up a little memo summarizing what you had learned to share with staff who weren't able to attend that training. Here is where you could tell us about it, the training that you attended and what you learned and how you put together a memo that was beneficial for other staff at your site. I would also encourage you to use this text box to talk about the other raw data that you enter in the other sheets. So for example, when we see this 1 here for employment, it really doesn't mean much to us and doesn't tell us anything about the work you're doing. So here is where you can tell us what that 1 means, that you conducted a survey to identify barriers to employment for residents, and then the information that was learned during that survey was used to develop programs to provide employment training. This is kind of a spot where you can really show off to us, and these narratives are super helpful to both your sites and CNCS in really understanding the work that our vistas are doing and the amazing impact that they're having. So now that we filled out all the sheets, I'm going to go ahead and take us back to the cover sheet. And as you can see, all of the information we've entered has been populated here in a really succinct summary so that we can easily identify how much of an impact our vistas have. As you can see also, there are a lot of zeros, and I just want to reassure everyone that zeros are perfectly fine. We expect zeros. We understand that our vistas are not working in all 3 of the focus areas, and also it's very early on in the service term, so there might not be a whole lot to report on yet. But Feel free to, as I said previously, use the stories from the field sheet to just tell us about what you're doing that has not been able, that you haven't been able to capture in the quantitative areas. So that is my overview of the reporting tool. I am going to stay on the line for a bit and answer any questions that anyone has. If you would like to ask your question over the phone, feel free to unmute yourself and do so. But thank you everyone for tuning in and listening to this webinar. We'll be sending out a follow-up email that has both a recording of the webinar, this reporting tool, in case you need to view this again.
There's also a really helpful FAQ sheet that goes through and answers pretty much all of your questions, so we'll be sending that out too. But I do want to go back. Can we go back to the new business process tab?
Yes.
We had a specific question about that, asking if you drastically improve a previous process, does that count under this tab? Yes, I put this in the comments, but yes, a significant improvement or the overhauling of existing programs or processes would count here as well. And then the other thing that we had was a request for more examples in this section. So can we go through some additional examples?
Yeah, so the some examples that I had talked about was potentially if you help develop a new marketing campaign, or let's say you helped get your organization set up on a new social media platform. That would be an example of a new business process. Also, let's say that you have created a system for how to gather information and draft grants, and you have put all of the data that might go into the grant and all the narrative or other kinds of testimony into one place and created a document telling employees how they might fill out that grant. That would be a new business process. Charlotte, do you have any other examples you want to add?
Those are all good. I mean, I think that we could come up with a lot of examples because this is a really broad category. I think the thing to keep in mind with this is that we're not looking at sort of individual one-off activities. For example, if you made a new flyer for a volunteer event, that would not count as a new business system or process. It doesn't quite fill that category. However, if you create a template that's going to be used for every volunteer event going forward, that's something sustainable, that's going to have a long-term impact, and that is definitely something that you could capture here. So I would just say that when you have specific questions about how this applies to your work, please don't hesitate to both have a conversation with your supervisor, but also reach out to Samantha to get clarity on this. I think the FAQ document might also provide some clarity. So it really, because you're all doing such different work, there's going to be things that come up where it'll just be more effective to handle those questions in a one-on-one setting. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, let me go back. Okay, some more questions. After we fill it out monthly, do we need to send it to someone or just save the results and add them to next month?
Yes, so each time that you fill this out monthly, you just need to save it in a location that's accessible both to you and your supervisor. You could use the Google Drive or your own site's network drive, whatever works for you. And then you will just save it for that month. So say you're filling it out month to month, you would make one for October, save it, and then you would make one for November, save it, so that at the end you have a collection of these that your supervisor will use to aggregate and find the information for the 6-month report.
Right, and the reason that we ask you to do it separately like that instead of just continuing to add on in one report is so that you can look back at a smaller snapshot of your service. So if you're aggregating all of your data in only one Excel tool, you won't have any way to go back and say, what you accomplished in a specific month, if we were to ask about that. It just helps with organization reasons and also ensures that we're not duplicating any data. So please do save your sheet, save a blank sheet, first of all, in your files, and then, rename and save each sheet for the specific reporting period on a monthly basis. Great question. We have another question here about asking what are outputs and to give some examples. I think that what you're referring to are, in general, we use the word outputs to talk about sort of what has been accomplished by the activities that you're doing. So there are a lot of examples of outputs, and pretty much all of the vertical columns in this sheet are talking about outputs. So we're asking about volunteers recruited, resources leveraged. All of these things are examples of outputs. So that's a pretty broad term that we're using. We're not talking about something very specific. But if you're still not sure about what we mean by all of that, please feel free to follow up after the webinar.
And also on that note, we use the terms outputs and outcomes on the volunteer sheet. So as Charlotte just went over, the outputs are a really broad term for any services you might be providing versus the outcomes, which are the community impact that result from your services.
Yeah, I think that only shows up on that tab.
Yeah, it does.
Don't get too confused about that stuff. Really, you should just be looking at, the questions that are being asked in each column and what we're looking for, and then just thinking individually about what it is that you're doing and how you can record the data for those accomplishments in this sheet.
Great question.
Does anyone want to unmute their phone or computer to ask a question out loud? I'm not seeing any new ones in the chat box here, but we're still around for questions. So I would recommend that while this is fresh in your mind, go and do your first report. So look back at whatever accomplishments you've had since the beginning of your service that very first day. You might not have any numbers at all to report right now. That's totally fine, like Sam said, but go ahead and do it anyway. Put the reporting dates in the date column on the cover sheet. And write in the stories for the field what exactly it is you have done for the past few months. And then set up your schedule, like Sam said, so that you know every month when you're going to sit down to fill this out. It also doesn't hurt to have a conversation with your supervisor about how reporting is going to look and how that relationship is going to be with them too. Kristen is asking, so if you did make a flyer for one event, would that just go into the stories from the field? Could you go to the stories for the field?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be an additional activity. So you would put a 1 in the data column where it says number of additional activities completed and or program outputs produced. And then you can write a little blurb about what that document was in the narrative portion here. Yeah, good question.
Awesome. Great questions, everyone. Thank you so much for asking them. Does anyone want to unmute their line, or we can go ahead and just sit here for another minute or so.
Follow-up question to that last one, should I attach the flyer to the Excel report? So that is something that you should absolutely make sure that your supervisor has access to, the flyer file, because they're actually the one who's going to submit this data to us in a cumulative 6-month report. And we do ask for additional attachments when they submit that report. So that includes anything like flyers, manuals, photos of you during service. So make sure that you have a conversation with your supervisor about where you're going to keep all of that great stuff. so that they know where to find it when it comes time for them to submit. All right, we have a couple more questions here. If we have numbers in the other sheets, do we have to type those into the stories from the field tab too, or is it additional? So it's to provide, use that sheet, the stories from the field, to provide clarification on any numbers that you don't feel capture the output. So I think Sam gave an example earlier. Another one would be that you submitted a grant proposal. So you're just going to have a 1 in that small section in the resource development tab. And that might not capture, you know, what organization the grant was from, what the dollar amount of the grant was. So if you have information like that that you want to include, please use the stories from the field tab. It's also space for things that aren't captured elsewhere. So it's kind of a catch-all. We have another question here. Much of what I do is on the marketing side, so social media, flyer creation, etc. So that will all go in the stories from the field as well. Yes, if you're creating new business processes along those lines, that would be captured there. And you can also provide narrative in stories from the field. If we have lots of narrative data, how should we ID all the different narratives in the stories tab? So the only person who's really going to need to navigate that is your site supervisor. So ask them that question, how they'll be able to navigate it best, and then you can move forward in that way. Because what they're going to do is copy paste that information into the report that they submit to us, and we don't have any specification about how you should format that. So have a conversation with your supervisor about that one. Good questions.
Okay. Are there any other questions coming down the line, or?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. But again, this will not be your last opportunity to ask questions. We're always around. Samantha is a really great resource, and you can always reach out to her. So if you're typing furiously and you don't make it in before the end of the webinar, don't be afraid. We can answer your questions after this webinar.
Is there another one, or? Okay. Well, it doesn't look like we're getting any further questions. So as Charlotte said, if something pops up and you forgot to ask, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, thank you everyone for tuning into this webinar. And as I said, I'll be sending out a follow-up email. But yeah, thank you everyone. Have a great rest of your day.